Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're talking renewable diesel. Renewable diesel is being heralded as one of the major new fuels that can combat climate change. Not only does it use sustainable feedstocks for its creation, it also produces less greenhouse gases and particulate emissions. But crucially, it can replace, without any change in the technology, petroleum diesel. As a result, demand is expected to explode over the next decade in Europe, Asia, and North America, and there's huge policy support. However, there are also challenges. The feedstocks compete with the human and animal nutrition supply chains, driving up prices, also promotes more land under cultivation with challenging crops like palm oil, particularly in Asia. And overall, there's a question whether the supply of the feedstocks can meet the demand for renewable diesel. Joining us to discuss is JW Hackett. JW is a commercial development and environmental and renewable fuels expert. He's worked for the EPA. He's also been on the US Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works and worked with the Renewable Energy Group. JW, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking renewable diesel, which is very much in the press at the moment. You're seeing huge run-ups in the feedstocks for it. Before we sort of dig into the technology and some of the history and the policy behind it, and then some of the challenges and opportunities about the market in renewable diesel, what is it and why is it causing such excitement, and how is it different to biodiesel?
So renewable diesel is a replacement for diesel fuel. It's interchangeable with diesel and meets the same specifications in the US and Europe, just like petroleum diesel does. So ASTM D975 in the US and EN 590 in Europe. Biodiesel, on the other hand, comes from a very different process, transesterification, that produces a different molecule and in some applications has blend limitations, whereas renewable diesel does not.
And the key thing about renewable diesel, of course, is that not only is it just like petroleum diesel, but it comes from sustainable sources and feedstocks, not fossil carbon feedstocks. It itself also burns cleaner, produces less emissions, less greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other particulates. So it's seen very much as this kind of complete renewable fuel compared to, as you mentioned, biodiesel or ethanol blends and so forth. Am I on the right track there?
There are some very attractive properties and qualities of renewable diesel that have sparked quite a bit of interest. Biofuels market generally is a very diverse place, and certainly a lot of these other fuels have a lot of other benefits from a business perspective or from an emissions perspective. Biodiesel, for example, is a little bit less energy intensive in its production, so the emissions reductions tend to be a bit better than renewable diesel. But generally, renewable diesel is a very versatile fuel that has attracted a lot of interest, and for good cause.
Yeah, and we're seeing growing demand, growing trading opportunities, both of the fuel itself as well as the feedstock. But there are some challenges around policy support as well as actually meeting the demand for production from a feedstock standpoint. Before we dig into that, can you just talk a little bit about the genesis of renewable fuels and renewable diesel in particular as it relates to public policy, both here in North America as well as in Europe and elsewhere around the world?
Biofuels typically have one or more of the following public policy drivers: desire for value-added agriculture, or anything that enhances the value of ag commodities, in other words, or jobs. 2, desire for energy security, or diversifying the sources of energy coming into or being used in the country. And finally, for environmental reasons, to reduce emissions. So these 3 things came together in the U.S. and that resulted in the Renewable Fuel Standard Program, which requires transportation fuel sold in our country to contain minimum volumes of certain renewable fuels. One of those buckets has a requirement to blend X amount of biodiesel and or renewable diesel from standalone facilities into the market. Co-processed renewable diesel can count in another one of the buckets, advanced. that can also then fill other buckets. So it's a great fuel that has made a pretty big impact on this program. It's something that's going to continue to grow, or has grown quite a bit, going from 9 billion gallons in 2008 to 36 billion gallons in 2022. Some of that volume has been waived due to some market issues, but you've seen a tremendous amount of growth here. Next year, EPA is going to have quite a bit of discretion on how to manage the program, and quite frankly, I don't envy any of them for the decisions that they're going to have to make. We can get into the politics later, but the other big driver is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, or the California LCFS, and it originated at roughly the same time as the RFS, and it requires oil refiners and fuel distributors to reduce the carbon intensity of their fuel, with a goal to reduce that CI by at least 20% by 2030. And this has been a huge driver of renewable diesel in the US. And it also has a couple of other really important impacts in the market. Some other states and Canadian provinces have copied California's approach toward their transportation fuel policy. So you've got the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, the British Columbia Low Carbon Fuel Standard, a Transportation and Climate Initiative with, I believe, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and DC have all opted in. And you got some others under discussion. For example, Washington State, New York, Colorado, Minnesota, Iowa, that it'll have a very big multiplier effect, impact on demand for these products going forward. And you also have a national clean fuel standard being finalized later this year and going into effect in late 2022 in Canada for I think it's a 13% reduction in emissions by 2030. And then if you go hop across the pond to Europe, you've got the Renewable Energy Directive, or RED, which was updated, RED 2, which goes through 2030. And that program increases the focus on advanced biofuels and sustainability, with aviation and marine fuels having the ability to opt in and I think count 1.2 times their energy content. Just to get a better feel for how this works, think about each individual member state having developed its own little RFS. So the rules get very complicated, and eligibility really depends on a combination of a couple of things: the feedstock being utilized, the process technology, and the end molecule. And not everything's going to qualify for every program. So it creates quite a accounting and compliance challenge.
Absolutely, and I think you stated that some of the challenges there, and we'll come on to, I guess, each of those three aspects. Just before we move on, you did mention the sustainable aviation fuel, or wanted to talk about that as it relates to Scandinavia, because I think that gives us an idea of the coming scale of demand that's forecast through various of these programs.
On the sustainable aviation fuel front, 2 countries already have introduced usage requirements. Sweden for 0.8% in 2021, which increases to 27% in 2030, and Norway for 0.5% last year, increasing to 30% in 2030. This is really interesting, an interesting development. A lot of interest groups and airlines have had quite a bit of interest in SAF. You can blend renewable diesel into jet fuel at certain levels. Not much SAF has been made relative to renewable diesel, just because of the incentives that were out there. Renewable diesel is getting excellent values for on-road applications, and it costs less to produce than jet fuel. But you might see a pretty big transition going forward on this front, in additional incentives to put this sort of product into the market. I think Airlines for America, one of the primary trade associations for the aviation sector, they announced a plan last month to try to get at least 2 billion plus gallons into the U.S. market by 2030. And then, of course, you've got the International Civil Aviation Organization with their efforts to keep emissions from rising. So this is an area that I'd keep an eye on for opportunities.
So you've got a patchwork at the moment of policies that are promoting the use of renewable diesel in particular, but alongside other renewable fuels, but these substantial future ramp-ups. You just look at that, right? 0.8% to 27% in Sweden over the next decade of using sustainable aviation fuel. That's a big source of potential demand. And I think it's worth reiterating that the key thing about renewable diesel compared to biodiesel and even ethanol blends is that renewable diesel is essentially chemically just petroleum diesel, and therefore it's much easier to make these switches, whereas biodiesel, as I understand it, it's using oxygenation and you've got issues with freezing. It needs to be blended with petroleum diesel. So it really kind of unlocks a huge amount of opportunity. You mentioned at the very start that it meets sort of the current US and European requirements for petroleum diesel. Just moving on to, I guess, digging very quickly into that technology piece. The technology here is this hydro treating, right? Is this relatively recent development in taking these oils and greases, the fogs that you mentioned, and turning them into renewable diesel. Can you just quickly, a couple of words on that, how it's done? I think the market is dominated by Neste at the moment from their plants in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, and in Singapore. We're still at quite a small production volume, right?
In all fairness to biodiesel, it has some advantages that renewable diesel doesn't have. It's less energy intense, so the emissions can be lower, and there's been an awful lot of work increasing the specifications for it. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't have the potential to go into some of those growing fields where you're going to need to decarbonize, and there aren't very many good solutions like aviation. On the technology front, basic technologies, this seems really new, but a lot of this stuff's been around for a while. Hydro treating, same type of technology as petroleum refining that involves heat, pressure, and hydrogen. Pyrolysis is also utilized where you heat up organic material in the absence of oxygen to change its chemical composition. Gasification as well to create a syngas that is then updated via Fischer-Tropsch process into a synthetic fuel. And there are some other folks out there that are making renewable diesel or looking to make other renewable hydrocarbons via miscellaneous biochemical and thermal.
So just from an orientation standpoint, how big is production right now and how much is that dominated by the likes of Neste?
Well, Neste is an extraordinarily large producer of renewable diesel, and they have some very large facilities in Europe and in Singapore. In the US, you have Renewable Energy Group, of course. You also have World Energy, which has a facility out in Southern California that I believe is supplying sustainable aviation fuel to some airlines at LAX. And Marathon Petroleum has recently come on with a very, very large plant. I believe it's up in North Dakota to supply the market. And looking forward, it's huge expansions underway. I've seen 5+ billion gallons of capacity under construction or announced for the next 5 to 10 years. And it's kind of hard to keep up with all the project news and announcements. So I'm guessing these numbers are probably outdated or will be soon. Diamond Green down in Louisiana is also a very, very large producer of renewable diesel. Elsewhere, there are several projects announced in Canada and 3 times plus expansion in both the European Union and Asia. And a pair of very large projects were announced in South America, one in Bolivia and the other in Paraguay, which you just have this massive, massive interest in this space, which we'll see if all of it gets built, but it's certainly going to be an interesting 5-10 years in this space.
Yeah. So we're going to cover we're going to move on to the feedstocks because that's really the story here, and then talk about the market and the demand part. But that expected capacity build out is a reflection of the great interest and demand in the space. And, I think you touched on it there, is renewable diesel is this confluence of policies, yes, that support prices. You see that in California. It is obviously significantly more expensive than diesel itself at the moment. But it's also this solution for hard to abate sectors like aviation, where we're a long way off electrification, or even hydrogen. Let's just spend a little moment on the feedstocks, because ultimately the story of building out capacity is the story of securing the feedstocks. Can you just give us a quick overview of what all goes into creating this renewable diesel?
So on the feedstock front, it's complicated. There's a very large, diverse group or set of feedstocks that can be used to to make renewable diesel. As a procurement professional in the past, kind of thought of ourselves as fat, oil, and grease, or FOG bartenders. And you'd make a cocktail, feedstocks to feed your plants and supply your end users. But they tend to follow into a couple of different buckets. Rendered products, so think of tallow coming from bovines, choice white grease, which is pork fat, poultry fat, used cooking oil, food preparation operations, yellow grease, which has a pretty broad definition or is used very broadly for mixed fats and veg oils, and fish oil and things like brown grease or trap grease, which are lipids found in grease traps at food service operations, septic systems, and wastewater treatment facilities, which is very, very tough to process.
So these rendered products, these are either waste products, straight up waste products, or they're low value secondary products from other processes, right? Which is kind of part of what makes all that group really attractive. And you do have, companies, organizations out there collecting waste cooking oil and you've suddenly seen a ramp up. It's fair to say that across this feedstocks for all of the biodiesel, we've seen a big increase in prices over the last year. And, you see the likes of Darling Ingredients, organizations that render chickens, which is sort of a euphemism for what actually goes on. All these fats are typically waste products, which is kind of some of the attraction about them going into a renewable fuel is that, otherwise they're just sluiced down drains and so forth.
That's right. They're generally thought of as waste products, but not everybody agrees with that characterization. There are some other markets for these products, notably oleochemical. Feedlots have purchased a lot of these products, like technical tallow, used cooking oil. So there are other applications for these products that prospective renewable diesel producers or renewable diesel producers have to.
Yeah. Then you've got, I guess, we're getting increasingly more sticky from a feedstocks perspective, and I mean in terms of challenging. You've got the vegetable oils, which is kind of where this issue that really is, I think, at the heart of this story of pushing food prices up, more land under cultivation. You've got the soybean oil, you've got the various vegetable oils, you've got one of the worst offenders, palm oil piece. Can you just cover that for us?
Well, agriculture's made some great strides in sustainability, and I'd like to chat a little bit about regenerative agriculture as an opportunity going forward. But generally, oilseeds have made up a huge chunk of the feedstock market historically for biomass-based diesel production, and it's really geared toward local interest. And going back on the feedstock commentary generally, typically for a lot of these programs, you have to have an appropriate feedstock, an appropriate processing technology, and an appropriate molecule. The eligibility for each of those things tends to be geared toward local incentives or local stakeholders. So all these things that I'm describing, they don't necessarily work in every program. So if you're in Southeast Asia, palm oil will go into that market in a big way, and it has in Europe as well. But there's a little bit of a trend away from that. In the U.S., it's not used. It's not eligible for many parts of the Renewable Fuel Standard program. It has some limited opportunities for grandfathered facilities at the lowest value in total renewable fuel.
So is that just to understand that, is that a function of policy? So, you can't use palm oil and meet the renewable fuel standards. And also, not every refinery can take the same feedstocks.
That's correct. It's a complicated fact-based inquiry for each of those three things: the feedstock, the process technology, and the molecule.
Which makes it quite a challenging bet, right? For these refiners, you've seen some fantastic successes out there with various organizations. You've got to make that bet on which type of refinery, which feedstock are you betting on, the region, as well as, ensuring that one's going to stay current in terms of policy support as well.
It is. It's a tough space to be in, but you do have a lot of options out there, going back to some of those public policy markets that I mentioned. And if you can make something, there's probably going to be a market for it somewhere. On the oilseed veg oil front, you have a lot of different feedstocks that have been used. Palm, distillers corn oil, and distillers sorghum oil, which is a co-product from ethanol production. canola and rapeseed, sunflower, camelina, carinata, or I think many people call it Ethiopian mustard, cottonseed, coconut oil, and cover crops like pennycress, which are used to improve soil health and water quality, etc., and slow erosion, and they bring other benefits to the land as well. And then there's a kind of a miscellaneous bucket of other feedstocks that refiners can use. For example, fatty acid distillates, which are byproducts from refining animal fats or oil seeds. You have palm oil mill effluent and palm sludge oil, which are waste products from the palm oil mill process generated from oil extraction, washing, and cleaning up processes. You've got palm oil recovered from spent bleached earth, which is a solid waste from a fine powder used in the bleaching process during palm oil refining. Tall oil is popular in Europe. It's a byproduct of the craft process of wood pulp manufacture and pulping trees. There's been some attempts to make biofuel feedstocks from things like algae, algal oil. It hasn't really taken off in a big way, but has potential down the line. There's one producer that I know of, and there are probably some others, making a product called biocrude, which is a pyrolysis oil from things like woody biomass that can be co-processed with petroleum or used in a standalone facility or used directly for heating oil. And then there have been a couple of projects announced that are utilizing trash and waste plastics to make their products.
So it kind of runs the gamut there. You've got sort of solutions that could be really net beneficial on all fronts, and others that, as we've kind of alluded to, have these bring other environmental degradation with them. So you've got I think we've got a good understanding of the feedstocks and some of the technology, and again why this is on everyone's radar. You've hinted at this, or you talked about this increase in capacity, and just looking at your notes here, you've got this. Actually, what looks like you've mentioned 5 billion gallons of capacity under construction, a huge run-up in that production, 3 times in the European Union, another 3-fold expansion in Asia. Can you just talk to us about the cost, the price, the market for renewable diesel?
On kind of the value proposition for refiners, or whatever you want to call it, renewable diesel producers sell a physical gallon of energy, a gallon of compliance or environmental attributes. So, for example, when you're selling your product, you get the energy value for it, but then you can either bundle it up with environmental attributes or incentives, or bifurcate them and trade them separately. So, for example, under the Renewable Fuel Standard program, if you're selling your fuel into the U.S., you can add the value of a RIN, and if you're going into California within the U.S., you can get the value of the low carbon fuel standard as well. There are other parts of the country you can sell into. So if you're going to Oregon, or you want to go into another state that has an incentive program, do what's some people refer to as stacking incentives. And really, it's the same netback, but you're just adding in the value of those stacked incentives to your revenue. To get a general idea of what profitability might look like, people have used this thing called the Hobo Spread, which is heating oil, soybean oil, and it's been used to gauge the profitability of biodiesel in the past and as a hedging tool. There have been some risk management challenges associated with making and selling this product in the past. That's because of the environmental commodities associated with it. Attempts to develop RIN futures markets didn't pan out in the past, but there seems to be a lot of new interest with growing volumes and market diversity for these products. So it looks hopeful, but it's also a good question mark for some of the challenges ahead.
Just going back to that Hobo Spread, can you give us any idea of how profitable this has been at the moment for these producers of the renewable diesel?
That's a tough question. You can take a look at some of the publicly traded companies over the past 5-10 years and get an idea of what they've been able to do. You also have some tax incentives that have increased profitability. There's a blender's tax credit in the U.S., which has kind of had like an on and off switch. Some people have taken risk on whether it would come back or not, and it always has, and it's in place right now, but it's definitely a political risk.
Yeah, and I think, as we kind of alluded to earlier on, you've seen incredible success with Neste and the likes of Green Plains, and a lot of it's kind of down to how they facilities they have, where they're located, and what feedstocks they have access to, right? Because again, it comes back to that kind of bet on what technology you build around what feedstocks. One thing to note here is, though, that we have seen, I think, soybeans up 25% this year. Soybean oil, sorry, is up 25% this year. You have seen a huge run up in the cost of the feedstocks, as particularly in the likes of waste cooking oil. You've had this challenge of not only is there a run up in prices, there's also been fewer restaurants as a result of COVID. So you've seen a huge increase in pricing there, as I understand it.
Certainly, this is adding a lot of demand to the market, and it's going to be a fascinating space going forward. Typically, some of those refined veg oils or products from oil seeds will have traded at a premium to these waste-based feedstocks. And I've heard people argue about this passionately, that they point to Europe as an example. Well, UCO's never traded above such and such, and I just don't think that's going to change going forward. And I've had others arguing that the environmental attributes associated with some of these waste feedstocks will eventually cause them to perhaps trade at a premium. I don't know what's going to happen there. I saw one product, palm oil recovered from spent bleached earth, that was cleaned up and refined, selling out of Malaysia a while ago, and it traded at a slight premium to palm oil, and that was based on the environmental attributes. But I definitely think that's an exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing a real huge demand in Europe and in the US, or in North America in general, for edible fuels traders. This is sort of the world is starting to compete for these proteins. We're going to come on to, I think this is the challenge. You're competing with these proteins with the likes of animal nutrition, human nutrition, and we have seen a big run up and an increased demand in the opportunity in trading, not only trading renewable diesel itself and renewable fuels, but also trading the feedstocks. I want to move on to just nail the forward market opportunities. So you've got all of these companies making big bets on capacity. You've got trading groups looking to build out trading teams. We've kind of touched on the first aspect of renewable diesel, which, because it is an equivalent to normal diesel, it can, at least for a period of time, decarbonize these sort of hard to abate sectors, right? So you've mentioned aviation. What else are we seeing there?
Aviation obviously has a lot of interest, and also I would keep an eye on the marine market. The International Maritime Organization has set a goal for emissions reductions by 2050, and certainly these renewable distillates might be able to play a big role in that going forward. I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's a big market, and I suspect it'll be difficult to decarbonize as well. And then you also continue to see opportunities in heavy duty applications and heating oil. Some of the states in northern New England may have robust markets for renewable distillates for home heating purposes, but there are definitely some question marks. Will electrification and natural gas continue to replace home heating oil in the Northeast? And on the on-road transportation front, see what happens with electric vehicles and other alternatives like renewable natural gas, hydrogen, etc. But I'd look to aviation and marine, and there'll probably be a substantial market, a big market for heavy-duty applications for quite some time.
Yeah. There's other things as well. You mentioned regenerative agriculture and there's sort of some added benefits there, and you've also got the whole chemicals industry. Let's move on so you've got this great story. You've got this kind of fantastic fuel that ticks so many boxes, from sustainable feedstocks through to compatibility with just any old diesel engine, through to it producing lower greenhouse gases, lower particulates. Let's talk about why this potentially won't take off, or why this is still a risky bet is probably the better way of saying it. First off, it really is about the feedstocks, and it's not just prices are a function of supply. Is there the supply out there across all of those different potential sources to actually really meet the demand that would be needed to replace diesel to any significant amount from an environmental standpoint?
That's the big question, and I don't think I've ever heard a great answer to it. If you take a look at how much feedstock demand is going to come online in the U.S., let's say the 5 plus billion gallons comes online. So thinking about a 100 million gallon a year addition to the market, as maybe a couple of the projects, each gallon of renewable diesel requires roughly 7+ pounds of feedstock. So you're talking about adding 700 million plus pounds of feedstock demand, or 300,000 plus metric tons of demand on an annualized basis. You have a huge addition to the demand side of the market going forward. Certainly, you can get the feedstock, but the question is, at what price will it be attractive enough to make money? And I think this is going to require, I guess, for lack of a better description, frenemies really coming together, rowing in the same direction. So getting new feedstocks approved for different regulatory programs, developing new ones like algal oil, and increasing yields, and additional penetration for UCO and waste grease collection in emerging markets, and also continued innovation and improvements in pretreatment of previously undesirable or really tough to use feedstocks like brown grease and trap grease will be critical to growth in the future.
You mentioned sort of, let's say call it 300,000 tons of feedstock being produced. That's quite a significant percentage of the world's current food supply, which I think is 1.5 billion metric tons. So you're talking there, whatever that is, 2% growth in the amount of food required to meet just that capacity coming online over the next, let's call it, decade or so. Is that, am I right with my maths there?
Looking at the feedstock challenge ahead, you're right. It's going to put huge additional demands on supply and demand for the FOG complex. But the good thing, or the at least reason for optimism or hope in this space, is that there's such a diversity of options to pick from. There are going to be opportunities to utilize things beyond the traditional oil seeds, and also collect lots of waste greases from emerging markets. So there are a lot of opportunities ahead, but you're certainly right. It's going to put there are going to be a lot of growing pains in this space, and it's not clear that all of this production will get built, but there'll certainly be a lot of changes over the next couple of years.
Because there's lots of other challenges associated with that, right? Not only do you have the environmental degradation through intensive agriculture and all of the other issues there, you've also got, and I'm just looking at your own notes as well, you've got this disconnect where we have kind of a very, at least in Europe and North America, a very efficient supply chain attached to grown crops. But actually, for all of these waste feedstocks, just at the household level, it's it's really distributed, but it also you don't have a mature industry to collect all of those waste fats and oils either, right?
There's certainly been a lot of entrepreneurial activity in this space. It's challenging. It's challenging abroad in the past for places that make a lot of or produce a lot of waste greases. There weren't really strong food safety laws on the books, or if they were on the books, those laws weren't enforced. So there was a lot of black market competition for taking used cooking oil, maybe cleaning it up a bit, and then putting it back into the food supply chain, which has some pretty serious consequences. I think if listeners are interested, they can Google some of the things that have happened in China on what's called gutter oil. But it's a tough space, and you have a huge collection footprint. So it's not like the traditional agribusiness model, or you're crushing product and aggregating it in large volumes in one place, and then you've got fantastic logistics to send it out to customers. It's picking up bits and pieces here and there, and bringing it to a central facility and cleaning it up, and then getting it out. And it's also a bit of a disconnect on volume as well. And transportation modes. So a lot of the places some of these waste products are coming from, they may not have efficient supply chains set up, or sufficient volumes to aggregate them appropriately and send them off. So you might be getting product in tough to handle feedstock that have to be shipped over long distances. When they arrive at a facility, they'll probably need to be heated up for a while. Then you need to get rid of the bag. And you have to have it in a large volume. They come in about 20 to 22 metric tons a piece, or about 6,000 gallons. So that's going to be a challenge, I think, for folks. But I've seen some some outfits, they have a model they'll aggregate feedstock in tanks around the world and send it out. So I suspect there's probably going to be a lot of innovation in that space as well.
I mean, again, it kind of, the idea sounds fantastic. Kind of the execution sounds, A, pretty carbon intensive, B, it's got a lot of other stakeholders and challenges around it as well from a feedstock standpoint. The other challenge here is that fundamentally at root at the moment, this is supported by policy as opposed to price, right? It's only happening, renewable diesel is taking over in California as a result of the low carbon fuel standards. It's not in Texas. Can you talk about what the political, it sounds positive from what's going on in Europe and in the US and the direction that we're taking. What's sort of the political stakeholder lens out there, and what are the challenges you see there for renewable diesel being a significant opportunity and market for the commodities world in general over the next decade?
The tough thing about this space is that it's biomass, and biomass politics have been very challenging over the years. If I were to try to draw a stakeholder Venn diagram of everyone's position on combination of those things I mentioned earlier, feedstock, process technology, and molecule, it would look like one of Jackson Pollock's splatter paint works of art. It's all over the map. You have very, very different positions. There are things that people like about it, but they also don't like historical agribusiness practices or stuff that's or forestry sector issues. The environmental NGOs have taken issue with some of the practices in those industries in the past. It's a tough space, and there was a quote in a Politico article from a former deputy administrator at EPA during the Obama administration that I think applies really well. And he was talking about biomass power, but I think it also applies to biofuels as well. He said, I'd say the people who are very enthusiastic should temper their enthusiasm, just as the opponents should probably temper their opposition. I think that's probably going to continue to be the case going forward. You have some changing factors. This fight, or this political fight, if you will, between electric vehicles and liquid fuels. It might create some frenemies that have taken opposite positions on things like the renewable fuel standard in the past to help kind of open up feedstock markets and other things to make it possible going forward. But there are definitely some headwinds, but you also have tailwinds too. That push for total electrification by environmental NGOs and others. That's a good question mark as to what this looks like going forward. And then going back to agriculture, there have been a lot of announcements on regenerative agriculture and kind of partnerships that haven't existed in the past. And it's something I'd really keep an eye on. It's really exciting. There are a lot of opportunities to really develop that stacked incentive part of the equation for the value of a renewable diesel gallon going forward. Things like no-till practices and others pick your part of the U.S. and elsewhere that are going to lower carbon intensity and produce other benefits as well. I know there have been some discussions concerning water quality trading, so some of these practices might lead to enhanced water quality. So you might be able to get things, and I'm just speculating here, you might be able to bring in additional credits to your bundle of environmental attributes. I saw a couple of projects that have created habitat for monarch butterflies, and they were generating local value for it. So there's a lot of really cool things that people can experiment with and figure out how to extract as much value as possible.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we didn't really touch on it in the technology side, but I always think that, and it's kind of my own personal view on hydrogen as well, is there are huge incentives here, as you kind of alluded to, for ag to come together with the traditional hydrocarbon industry, because actually they already have the pre-existing technology, the facilities, the supply chains to get this fuel to market. Even the renewable diesel itself is, we didn't cover it, but is co-processed alongside other hydrocarbon chemicals, right? It fits, it meshes very well with existing infrastructure that you can see, this being even at just a political lobbying level, a really important industry for the refiners to focus on, as their solution or part of their solution in energy transition.
Yeah, certainly, but everybody's got a different business model and interest, and those conversations are definitely going to be very difficult. But I think, in my personal opinion, I suspect more cooperation going forward.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I think you've given a really good overview of renewable diesel. I think we've probably got more episodes centered on this area, because I think it is, it's a real hot topic at the moment. It's something that people are, at the very least, wanting to understand and gearing up for. And I think there's just huge trading opportunities around this, very broad feedstock suite that you can use, as well as the renewable diesel itself being what would appear to be a potentially excellent fuel. So JW, thanks very much for your time.
Really appreciate your time. Enjoyed the chat.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. To find out more about HC Insider and Human Capital, a search firm dedicated to the commodities sector, go to www.hcinsider.global, where you'll find more original content on the commodities sector and more details on our offering as a search firm and our locations around the world. Thanks again for listening.